Millionaire offers made a deal that will change their lives forever. You won't believe what happens. Jacob Henderson, a millionaire with a mansion that looked more like a palace, had it all. Wealth, power, and an empire that most could only dream of. Yet, despite the luxury that surrounded him, he was haunted by one burning question. Who would inherit all of this when he was gone? He had no children, no heirs, and no one to share his life with. As he sat in his grand office, looking out over his sprawling estate, the emptiness grew deeper. In a moment of desperation, Jacob came up with a plan, one that would change both his life and that of Emma Carter, his 24-year-old maid. She was young, healthy, and had no emotional attachments. Could she be the answer to his problem? Jacob decided to offer her an unbelievable deal. Carry his child for a large sum of money, and after the birth, she could leave and start a new life. But what he didn't expect was that this offer would set in motion a series of events that would force both of them to confront their deepest fears and desires. Why should you continue watching? Because what begins as a cold, business-like transaction between a millionaire and his maid evolves into a story of love, transformation, and second chances. Will they find what they truly need in each other? Or will the weight of their arrangement tear them apart? Keep watching to find out, and remember to subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this. Jacob Henderson's mansion was as grand as any palace. An imposing, three-story structure nestled at the edge of the city, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens and a towering iron gate. Inside, the walls were adorned with priceless art, marble floors gleamed in the sunlight, and every piece of furniture was meticulously chosen for its opulence. Yet, despite all the luxury around him, Jacob felt a profound emptiness. It wasn't that he didn't have everything money could buy. He did. What he didn't have was someone to share it with, someone to carry on his legacy when he was gone. His mind had been consumed with thoughts of this for months, but he hadn't found the answer. What would happen to his wealth, to all his accomplishments, when he left this world? Sitting behind a large, oak desk in his office, Jacob glanced out of the window. His fingers drummed absently on the surface, a rhythmic sound that echoed his restless thoughts. The massive property sprawled beneath him, yet it felt smaller than ever. Who's going to inherit this? He muttered to himself, his voice barely louder than the gentle hum of the air conditioning. The mansion, the cars, the yachts, none of it seemed to matter anymore. Not when he realized he had no one to leave it to. Jacob had no children, no family, and the loneliness that came with wealth was starting to settle deep into his bones. Just then, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Jacob turned in his chair and glanced through the open door of his office, watching the figure of his maid, Emma Carter, pass by. Emma was 24, with long, flowing chestnut hair and an air of quiet determination that caught Jacob's attention more than it should. She moved through the mansion with the precision of someone who had grown up in hardship, taking care of every detail without ever asking for praise. In her simple uniform, she looked out of place in such a luxurious setting. But there was something about her that fascinated Jacob. She had a quiet strength, a calmness in the midst of all his excess. It was in that moment that Jacob's mind began to form a plan. What if? The idea came quickly, like a flicker of light in the darkness. He could offer Emma a deal, something that would give him the heir he desperately needed. Emma had no family of her own, no one who depended on her. She was young, healthy, and, most importantly, uninterested in any personal gain. What if she agreed to have his child in exchange for a large sum of money, enough to change her life, enough to ensure her future? Jacob stood up, his mind racing. He walked to the door of his office, calling out to her. "Emma, come here." Emma paused in the hallway, startled by the sudden summons. She had never been called into his office before, and she knew this was serious. Wiping her hands on her apron, she made her way toward him, her heart beating faster than usual. Jacob's office was imposing, dark with shelves lined with books, a large desk covered with paperwork, and the faint smell of polished furniture and leather. Emma felt small in the vastness of the room, her shoes clicking softly on the floor as she stood before him. "Sit down, Emma," Jacob said, his voice cool and direct. She did as instructed, taking a seat across from him, her hands nervously folding in her lap. "I've been thinking about something," Jacob began, leaning back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. "I need an heir, someone to carry on my name, someone to take over everything I've built." Emma nodded, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I understand, sir," she replied softly. "I've decided to offer you a deal," Jacob continued, his voice steady. "I want you to have my child." Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. She blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. I'm sorry, sir. Did you say?" Jacob leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk. "I need an heir. I've tried to find a woman who could have a child for me, but it hasn't worked out. But I think you're the perfect candidate. You're young, healthy, and most importantly, you have no emotional attachments to me. I'm offering you a large sum of money in exchange for carrying my child. After the birth, the child will stay with me, and you will have your money and be free to live your life however you choose." Emma's heart raced. This was insane. Her mind spun with confusion, but Jacob's words echoed in her head, louder than anything else. Money. She thought of the debts she had back home, the pile of bills that seemed to grow higher each month, her mother's medical bills, the rent she couldn't afford, everything she worked for. All of it was slipping through her fingers no matter how hard she tried to hold on. She tried to steady her breathing as she absorbed his words. She was just a maid in this mansion. She had no family, no future, no one to turn to. But this offer could change everything. "But why me?" Emma finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jacob shrugged, as though it were obvious. "You're trustworthy, discreet. You don't have any emotional ties to me, and you don't want anything from me other than the money. The simple. You'll have the baby, receive your payment, and leave. You can start a new life. No strings attached." Emma's mind raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. On one hand, it was absurd. On the other, it seemed like her only chance to fix everything. She thought of her sick mother, of the hospital bills that kept piling up, and of the rent she couldn't afford. I need to think about it," Emma said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob nodded. "Of course, I understand. Take your time. But know this, the offer won't last forever." As Emma left his office, her thoughts were in turmoil. She had never expected anything like this, and yet, deep down, she knew she couldn't let it go. Her mother's life depended on it. She spent the entire night tossing and turning, the weight of Jacob's offer pressing down on her chest like a stone. Her mother's condition was worsening. She had no time to waste. But what was the cost of accepting such an offer? Could she really go through with it? The next morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, Emma made a decision. She knew she didn't have a choice. When she walked into Jacob's office that day, her mind was made up. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm, though her heart was racing. "I'll carry your child." Jacob didn't seem surprised. He nodded and stood up, retrieving a prepared contract from the drawer. "This will ensure everything is clear. No complications. You will receive your payment after the child is born, and the child will stay with me. You will be free to leave after that." Emma took the contract in her hands, her fingers trembling. As she read through the details, she realized just how clinical and detached it all was. This wasn't about family. It wasn't about love. It was a business deal, but it was her only option. With a deep breath, she signed. Jacob took the contract from her and smiled. "It's done." Emma nodded, her heart heavy with the enormity of what she had just agreed to. This wasn't just a business arrangement. It was a choice that would change her life forever. She left his office that day feeling like a part of her had been erased. But at the same time, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time in a long while, she had a plan, a way out. Now, the only question was, what would happen next? The weeks that followed felt like a blur to Emma. Each day was a mix of anticipation and dread, and the once familiar mansion had become a place of overwhelming uncertainty. It wasn't the grandeur that bothered her. She had gotten used to the polished floors and the golden chandeliers. It was the quiet, lingering tension between her and Jacob. At first, their interactions were brief, formal, and awkward. Jacob was a businessman at heart, and every moment spent together felt like part of a cold transaction. He would ask about her health, but it was clear that his questions were more about ensuring his investment was going smoothly than expressing any real concern. But as the weeks passed, things began to shift. Jacob, despite his usual detachment, started to show up at her medical appointments, his tall, imposing figure looming in the doorway as Emma was examined. He sat in silence, watching her with a strange intensity that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "I'm fine, really," Emma would say, trying to reassure him whenever he asked about her well-being. Though she was aware he wasn't truly listening to her words, it was his presence that mattered. "I'm here to make sure everything goes smoothly," Jacob would reply in his typical, businesslike tone, though there was a hint of something softer beneath it. She wasn't sure what to make of it. At times, Jacob seemed almost human, asking if she was comfortable, bringing her warm blankets when she complained about the chill in the air. But each time he spoke, there was a chill in his words, like he had built a wall around himself that no one could breach. One evening, as Emma sat on the couch in the staff room, her hand resting gently on her growing belly, Jacob appeared at the door. He hadn't knocked, just stepped inside as if it were his right. His usual impeccable suit was replaced by a more casual look, a white shirt and dark jeans. But even so, he still carried the weight of authority in his stance. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his tone a little warmer than usual. Emma looked up, her heart skipping a beat at the unexpected softness in his voice. "I'm doing well, thanks. Just a bit tired, you know?" Jacob studied her for a moment before nodding, his eyes flicking to the window where the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. The silence stretched between them, but this time, it didn't feel uncomfortable. Felt unfamiliar. He cleared his throat, stepping closer, but not too close. "The doctor says everything's going well," he said, almost as if he were reassuring himself. "How do you feel about all of this?" Emma was taken aback by the question. No one had ever really asked her how she felt about the situation. Sure, she had signed the contract, but that didn't mean she wasn't conflicted. The baby growing inside her, Jacob's cold offer, and the knowledge that soon she would have to walk away from it all. It all seemed so much to bear. "I don't know," she said quietly, her gaze dropping to her hands resting on her belly. "It's a lot to process, but I'm doing it for my mother. I have to. This is the only way." Jacob watched her, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. He opened his mouth to speak, but then hesitated, clearly unsure of what to say. "I know you're doing this for your mother," he finally said, his voice quieter now. "And I respect that. But I also want you to know that it's not just about the money. I don't expect you to act like this doesn't matter." Emma looked up, confused by the words. What was Jacob really saying? Did he care about her in some way? Or was he simply trying to sound more empathetic because he felt guilty? "Do you?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Do you really care? Or is this all just another deal to you?" Jacob's expression darkened for a moment, the cold, calculating mask he usually wore slipping back into place. "It's not a deal," he said firmly, his voice more authoritative again. "It's a way to make sure you're taken care of. And the child, of course." His words left Emma feeling confused. It was hard to tell whether he was just a businessman trying to find the most efficient solution to a problem, or whether, in some strange way, he was beginning to feel something for her, even if he didn't know how to express it. Later that evening, Emma found herself alone in her room, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was clouded with thoughts of Jacob's actions and his words. Part of her wanted to dismiss everything as just another manipulation. But another part of her, the part she didn't want to admit existed, felt touched. Jacob had been checking in on her more often, offering small gestures of kindness that felt different from his usual coldness. He had arranged for her to have extra pillows to sleep more comfortably, and the nurse who had been assigned to monitor her was kind and attentive. Still, despite all of this, Emma remained distant. She couldn't afford to get attached to someone who would, in the end, be nothing more than a business partner. It was when she overheard a conversation between Jacob and one of his associates that things started to shift in her mind. She had been passing by his office when she heard his deep voice, more weary than usual, speaking with a man she didn't recognize. "I don't know what I'm doing." Jacob's voice carried through the door, laced with frustration. "I've spent so much time trying to build something, but now I realize I don't know how to keep it. I don't know how to take care of what matters." Emma froze in the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never heard Jacob speak like that before. It was raw, vulnerable, a side of him she hadn't thought existed. For the first time, she wondered if there was more to Jacob Henderson than the cold, controlling businessman she had known. The next day, she found herself walking through the mansion's garden, her hand resting on her stomach. She had spent the entire morning pacing back and forth in her room, wrestling with herself. What if Jacob wasn't just trying to manipulate her? What if there was something more? Something that made him act this way, despite his usual emotional distance? Jacob appeared on the path ahead of her, looking as composed as ever, but his eyes softened when he saw her. Without a word, he walked toward her, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Emma, you look troubled," he said, his voice quiet but concerned. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure this is what you want, Jacob? To keep the baby? To raise it like a business investment?" He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. There was a long pause before he answered. "No," he said, his voice steady but with an underlying pain. "It's not just that. I've started to realize that maybe I'm not as prepared as I thought. Maybe I don't know what I'm doing." For the first time, Emma saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a rare moment of vulnerability that caught her off guard. She looked at him, her gaze softening slightly. "Then what do you want, Jacob?" Jacob took a step closer, his face serious. "I don't know, but I think I'm starting to care about what happens next. About you, about the baby. I don't want this to be just a transaction." Emma's heart skipped a beat, her mind swirling with confusion. Could this really be happening? Was Jacob actually beginning to care? She didn't know how to answer him. But in that moment, she felt a shift that made her question everything she had believed about their arrangement. The days following their conversation in the garden felt like a strange limbo for Emma. Jacob had begun showing a different side of himself, one that was harder to ignore. Gone was the cold, calculating man she had first met. In his place was someone who, despite his struggles with emotions, seemed to genuinely care. His actions, though still reserved, spoke louder than words. He began accompanying her to doctor's appointments without being asked, asking about her health, her well-being, even her thoughts on how things were progressing. Emma tried to remain distant, reminding herself that this was still a business deal, just a very personal one. But with every passing day, it became harder to maintain that distance. She found herself looking forward to his visits, even if only to see a glimpse of the man who was slowly starting to show her a new kind of care. A part of her resisted the growing connection between them, but another part couldn't help but wonder if he was changing because of her, or perhaps because of the baby. One evening, Jacob walked into the staff room, where Emma was sorting through some papers on the table. He paused at the door, leaning against the frame, a slight smile tugging at his lips as he watched her. "Still working?" he asked, his tone teasing but gentle. Emma looked up, startled. She hadn't expected him to find her there. "I couldn't sleep. Just catching up on things," she replied, her voice soft. Jacob stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the papers in front of her. "You should rest more," he said, his voice low but caring. "I'm fine," Emma said quickly, not wanting to sound weak. "But I'll rest later." Jacob raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint smile. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe I could help you with something. You've been doing everything on your own for so long. Maybe it's time to let someone else take some of the weight." Emma was taken aback by his offer. It wasn't like Jacob to offer help, especially without any ulterior motives. She studied him for a moment, unsure of what to make of his words. "I don't want to trouble you," she replied, her voice hesitant. Jacob's smile faded, and his eyes softened. "It's not trouble. It's what anyone would do for someone they care about." Emma froze. Care about? Had he really said that? Her heart skipped a beat as she realized that Jacob wasn't just being polite or distant. For the first time, his words carried a sincerity she couldn't deny. But still, she hesitated. "I don't know, Jacob. It feels complicated." Jacob stepped closer, his expression earnest. "I know it's complicated, but sometimes things are worth the complication." He reached out, gently placing his hand on hers. "We can figure this out together." Her breath caught in her throat. For the first time since agreeing to this arrangement, Emma wondered if there could be something more than just a transaction. Could they really find a way to make this work, to make it meaningful? That evening, Jacob invited Emma to dinner, something more casual than the grand dinners he typically hosted. He had arranged it in the dining room, with simple dishes and a warm, inviting atmosphere. The soft light of candles flickered on the table, casting shadows across the room. As they sat down to eat, Jacob's usual business demeanor seemed to have melted away. There was a sense of vulnerability in his posture, a rare softness that made Emma feel both at ease and unsure all at once. "Thank you for joining me tonight," Jacob said, his voice low. "I wanted to talk about us." Emma took a deep breath, her mind swirling. "What about us?" "I've been thinking a lot," Jacob began, looking at her seriously. "I know I've been distant and cold at times, but I want to change that. I don't want to just be the man who made a business deal. I want to be someone who's part of your life, someone who actually cares about you, not just about the child you're carrying." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. "Jacob, this was never supposed to be anything more than an arrangement. I agreed to this because I had no other choice." "I know," he said softly, his eyes intense. "But what if there's more to this? What if it's not just about the baby anymore?" Emma looked away, unsure how to respond. She had felt the changes in him, had sensed the shift, but she hadn't allowed herself to truly acknowledge it until now. "You're asking a lot, Jacob," Emma whispered. "We can't just pretend like the past doesn't exist. This was supposed to be a deal, nothing more." "I know, but I'm asking you to give me a chance. I'm asking you to trust me," Jacob said, his voice steady, yet vulnerable. Emma felt the weight of his words pressing against her. For so long, she had kept her guard up, telling herself that this was all temporary, that once the baby was born, she would walk away, no strings attached. But now, as she looked into Jacob's eyes, she wasn't so sure anymore. "I don't know if I can trust you, Jacob," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "After everything, I don't know if I can believe that you really care." Jacob's expression softened, and he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I understand your fear, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Tears welled in Emma's eyes, and she quickly looked away, unable to let him see the turmoil inside her. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Emma found herself in Jacob's office. He had asked her to come by before she went to her room for the day. She had agreed, though her heart was heavy with the uncertainty of what was to come. When she entered, Jacob was standing by the window, staring out at the gardens below. He didn't turn as she entered, but he spoke as though he had been waiting for her. "I've thought a lot about what you said last night," he began, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "I don't want to just be someone who makes promises. I want to show you that I'm capable of more than just cold calculations. I want to be the man you can rely on." Emma stood silently, taking in his words. She felt a stirring in her chest, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. "I'm willing to change, Emma," Jacob said, turning to face her. "I don't expect you to trust me overnight, but I hope, over time, you'll see that I'm serious about us." Emma looked at him, feeling the weight of her emotions swell inside her. "I'm not sure I can just forget everything," she whispered, "But I'm willing to try." Jacob stepped closer to her, his expression sincere. "That's all I'm asking for, a chance." As the days passed, Jacob's actions spoke louder than any words could. He spent more time with Emma, helping her with things she never expected from him. They talked more, shared small moments of laughter, and began to form a connection that was far deeper than either of them had anticipated. Then, one day, the moment came. Emma's labor started unexpectedly, catching both of them off guard. The pain hit her suddenly, and Jacob, despite his usual calm demeanor, was frantic. He took charge, his hands trembling as he helped her into the car and rushed her to the hospital. In the delivery room, Emma clutched his hand through every contraction, feeling the intensity of the moment. Jacob stayed by her side the entire time, offering words of encouragement despite his own fear. And then, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room, and for the first time, Jacob allowed himself to break down. Tears filled his eyes as he held the baby, a tiny life that was part of him, part of Emma. "He's perfect," Jacob whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Emma, exhausted but filled with a deep sense of love and relief, smiled softly. "He's ours, Jacob." For the first time, they both understood that this wasn't just about business anymore. It was about something far more powerful. And in that moment, as Jacob cradled their child, both of them realized that the life they had built together, a life filled with love, sacrifice, and unexpected turns, was just beginning. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Emma and Jacob's life together slowly transformed. What had begun as a cold, calculated arrangement based on necessity had evolved into something far more meaningful. Their connection, once driven by circumstance, was now rooted in understanding, trust, and a shared love for their child. Emma's heart, once closed off from the world, had opened up to the possibility of a future where she wasn't just a maid in a mansion, but a mother, a partner, and a woman who had found something she thought was lost forever: love. Jacob, too, had changed. The cold, distant businessman who once saw relationships as mere transactions had grown into someone who could feel, who could care. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart had cracked, piece by piece, and in their place was a man willing to fight for the people he loved. It wasn't easy, no transformation ever is, but it was worth it. Jacob knew that now. Together, they had built something real, something that couldn't be measured in money or contracts, but in moments shared, sacrifices made, and love given. Emma had entered his life as an answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask, but in the end, she became the reason for everything he had ever done. As they looked into the future, they knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but they were no longer facing it alone. With their son in their arms and the promise of a new beginning ahead, Emma and Jacob had created a family, one built on love, growth, and the power of second chances. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Emma and Jacob's life together slowly transformed. What had begun as a cold, calculated arrangement based on necessity had evolved into something far more meaningful. Their connection, once driven by circumstance, was now rooted in understanding, trust, and a shared love for their child. Emma's heart, once closed off from the world, had opened up to the possibility of a future where she wasn't just a maid in a mansion, but a mother, a partner, and a woman who had found something she thought was lost forever: love. Jacob, too, had changed. The cold, distant businessman who once saw relationships as mere transactions had grown into someone who could feel, who could care. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart had cracked, piece by piece, and in their place was a man willing to fight for the people he loved. It wasn't easy, no transformation ever is, but it was worth it. Jacob knew that now. Together, they had built something real, something that couldn't be measured in money or contracts, but in moments shared, sacrifices made, and love given. Emma had entered his life as an answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask, but in the end, she became the reason for everything he had ever done. As they looked into the future, they knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but they were no longer facing it alone. With their son in their arms and the promise of a new beginning ahead, Emma and Jacob had created a family, one built on love, growth, and the power of second chances. Message and call to action. The story of Emma and Jacob reminds us that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead us to the most meaningful destinations. Whether it's love, redemption, or transformation, every story has the potential to change us. And just like Emma and Jacob, we all have the ability to grow, to learn, and to open our hearts to new possibilities, no matter where we begin. If you've enjoyed this incredible story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming, life-changing stories. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Do you believe that love can truly transform even the most unlikely of situations? We'd love to hear your opinions. And remember, transformation begins with one step, and that step might just be a click away. So make sure to turn on notifications to stay updated with all our future videos and keep the journey of inspiration going. What do you think of Emma and Jacob's journey? What lessons did you take away from their story? Share your thoughts with us in the comments and don't forget to engage with our channel for more amazing content.